Today, we're undertaking a really fascinating and honestly, incredibly rigorous exercise. We're going to put on our critical linguist hats and conduct a data-driven forensic audit of the Proto-Indo-European language family tree. But here's the catch. We're going to do it by strictly applying the field's very own rules, its own methodology, and its own evidentiary standards. For centuries, the reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European, or PIE, has been presented as this foundational bedrock of historical linguistics. But what actually happens when we put this mainstream linguistic consensus on the witness stand? Grab your notebooks, because we're going to test this framework to its absolute limit.
Today, we're tackling one of the most widely accepted historical frameworks in all of academia, the timeline of the Proto-Indo-European language, or, just PIE for short. Now, this is the theoretical mother tongue for everything from English to Sanskrit. But instead of arguing over ancient artifacts or getting lost in the weeds of complex grammar, we're going to do something way simpler. We're actually going to test this established academic framework against its very own fundamental arithmetic.
It's a pretty fascinating question, right? Like, what exactly are we supposed to do when a widely accepted consensus theory hits an absolute mathematical wall? Because usually we just assume that if a historical timeline is printed in a textbook, the basic numbers behind it must add up perfectly. Well, today we are looking at some seriously compelling research suggesting that the accepted timeline for this language's evolution might literally be a chronological impossibility. Okay, let's dive into this.
Here's our quick roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with the big math problem, then move into setting the maximum clock. From there, we'll hit the 3 mandatory language leaps, check out the speed limit of change, see exactly why the arithmetic fails, and finally, rethinking linguistic theories. And don't worry, we aren't getting bogged down in academic jargon today. We're just solving a simple logic puzzle together. All right, part 1, the big math problem, or what we can think of as the suitcase problem of language. To really grasp the chronological collapse of this theory, I want you to picture this. Imagine you're planning a massive 3,000-mile road trip. You map out all your mandatory stops, you crunch the numbers for the absolute minimum distance to get to your destination, and bam, it's 3,000 miles exactly. But there's a huge catch. Your car only holds enough gas to travel 2,600 miles. Honestly, it doesn't matter how great your map is or how badly you want to get there. The physical reality is that the math just doesn't allow it. You literally cannot fit a 3,000-mile trip into a 2,600-mile tank of gas. Keep that road trip analogy in the back of your mind as we map out this historical language timeline. Which brings us to Section 2, setting the maximum clock and establishing the earliest possible dates. So, to figure out if our historical linguistic road trip has enough gas, we have to establish the absolute most generous dates possible for our start and end points. Foundational scholars, people like Gimbutas and David Anthony, they generally place the early PIE periods somewhere around 4,000 to 3,500 BCE, with 3,300 BCE being the standard widely cited anchor date. But hey, to give the framework literally every possible concession, we're going to use the absolute earliest, most generous date ever proposed, 4,500 BCE. Now, as for the endpoint, Old Sanskrit, mainstream experts like Michael Witzel date Rigvedic Sanskrit to between 1,500 and 1,000 BCE. Once again, giving the absolute most generous alternative reading, we can push that back to 1900 BCE. We are intentionally giving the current theory every single benefit of the doubt here. So the crucial point is this number right here, 2,600 years. If we take our ridiculously generous starting date of 4,500 BCE and subtract that incredibly generous ending date of 1900 BCE, we get 2,600 years. This is it. This is the absolute maximum ceiling the framework can possibly produce. Think of this as the total amount of gas in our car for this evolutionary journey. Every single thing that happens between the original mother tongue and Old Sanskrit has to fit inside this 2,600-year window. Okay, moving on to Section 3, 3 mandatory language leaps. The required evolutionary steps. Here's the thing. The original PIE language doesn't just jump straight to Sanskrit overnight in one smooth move. According to the textbook standard established by scholars like Benjamin Fortson, there are mandatory intermediate stages. And each of these stages requires complete isolation to propagate its own unique systematic changes uniformly across the entire vocabulary. Let's walk through this lineage step by step. Step 1. The original PIE language diverges into a completely new branch called Proto-Indo-Iranian. Step 2, that language then splits, diverging into Proto-Indo-Aryan and Avestan-Iranian. And finally, Step 3, that Proto-Indo-Iranian language evolves and develops into Vedic Sanskrit. This isn't just a casual shift in local accents, folks. Each stage is treated by academics as a completely distinct language with its own unique identity, phonology, and grammar. This means every single leap requires its own independent block of development time. Next up, Section 4, the speed limit of change. Establishing a minimum time per stage. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is if we know there are 3 mandatory evolutionary leaps, well, how long does a single step actually take? Luckily, we have a perfect, historically documented benchmark. The single best documented case of language divergence in human history is Latin evolving into the Romance languages. French, Spanish, Italian. From classical Latin to a language as fully distinct as French, that took roughly 1,000 to 1,200 years of separation. Leading scholars already acknowledge that the intermediate stages of PIE are just as distinct from one another as French is from Latin. Therefore, they logically require an equivalent amount of time for those systematic innovations to accumulate. So let's just do the simple arithmetic. We've got 3 mandatory layers of divergence. We multiply that by the absolute minimum observed rate of 1,000 years per layer. 3 times 1,000 equals a 3,000-year minimum requirement. That right there is the length of our historical road trip. 3,000 years, bare minimum to get from PIE all the way to Sanskrit. Which leads us directly into Section 5, why the arithmetic fails, the chronological deficit. We now have all the pieces of our logic puzzle, so it's time to crunch the final numbers. Check this out. If we use the standard most accepted dates in the field, 3300 BCE for PIE and 1500 BCE for Sanskrit, we only have a window of 1800 years to fit a 3,000-year process. That is a massive chronological deficit of 1,200 years. But, okay, what if we use the generous dates? Those absolute maximum concessions we talked about earlier. Starting at 4500 BCE and ending at 1900 BCE gives us a 2,600-year window. But we still have that 3,000-year minimum requirement. So even when bending the timeline to its absolute breaking point, the framework falls mathematically short by 400 years. And this brilliantly illustrates the core issue right here. When you put it side by side, it's obvious. The first bar is our absolute maximum available time, our biggest possible gas tank, at 2,600 years. The second bar is the absolute minimum required time, the shortest possible road trip, at 3,000 years. The arithmetic simply does not close. It is mathematically impossible to fit those 3 distinct mandatory divergence layers into the available timeline. Let's move to Section 6 and see how this builds into rethinking linguistic theories and the implications of the logic gap. When a fundamental logic gap like this is exposed, it honestly forces us to rethink what we just accept as settled history. Because think about it, what we've done here isn't bringing in outside controversial data. No, this is a strict internal audit. The mathematical deficit proves the current framework literally cannot validate its own historical lineage. By taking the framework's own anchor dates, its own required intermediate steps, and the field's own observed rate of language change, we arrive at a stark mathematical contradiction. The theory collapses under its own internal weight. To really summarize this profound logic gap, I want to read this exact quote directly from the source material we analyze today. This is not an external critique. It is the framework's own numbers failing its own requirements. I mean, that hits the nail on the head. This is a fundamental, undeniable mathematical impossibility. The pieces of the puzzle, exactly as they are currently cut by the academic consensus, simply do not fit together. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly vital question. What exactly should the academic community do when standard consensus contradicts standard arithmetic? Do we change the dates? Do we rethink the evolutionary steps entirely? Or do we need a completely new framework? I want you to imagine playing a game where the rules are supposedly incredibly strict, but those very same rules actually come packaged with built-in cheat codes, right? It begs a massive question for anyone who really cares about scientific rigor. Can a scientific theory be impossible to fail? Think about it. In standard science, if new data contradicts your theory, well, your theory breaks. But what happens if a discipline builds a framework where no matter what conflicting data pops up, the theory can just absorb it and claim it was right all along? Okay, let's dive right into this by grounding ourselves in the absolute gold standard of modern science, falsifiability. For something to actually be a tested scientific hypothesis, there has to be a logical possibility that an observation or an experiment can prove it false. If you claim, say, all swans are white, discovering just a single black swan falsifies your entire claim. That's how science progresses. In this explainer, we're going to use this absolutely crucial standard as our lens to examine a major controversy in the linguistic world. Consider this as simple briefing on why the foundational methods used to reconstruct historical languages might not actually be passing the test. Let's look at Section 1, the exceptionless sound law, a foundation built in the 1800s. To really get this, we've got to travel back to the 19th century. Early linguists were working on Proto-Indo-European reconstruction. Basically, they were trying to reverse engineer this massive family tree of languages to find their unrecorded ancient ancestor. But to be taken seriously as a hard science, they needed concrete, mathematical-style rules. So, in 1876, August Leskian began formalizing these rules. By 1878, a group known as the Neogrammarians published their famous manifesto. But almost immediately after, in 1885, Hugo Schuchardt published a formal critique. And this brilliantly illustrates a period of rapid scientific ambition that was followed, basically overnight, by deep structural pushback. The absolute core of that ambition was just this single sentence: sound laws operate without exception. That was the central axiom of the 1878 Neogrammarian Manifesto by Osthoff and Brugmann. This wasn't just some casual observation, okay? This was their absolute foundational claim. It was the entire basis for the comparative method used to reconstruct these historical languages. They argued that linguistic sounds change uniformly, blindly, and without a single exception. And without this super rigid claim, their whole reconstruction method literally loses its scientific basis.
Which brings us to Section 2, the built-in escape clauses, or fixing the game.
All right, here is the plot twist. In the real world, as we all know, linguistic data is messy. People speak differently, dialects merge, and words just don't follow perfect mathematical rules. So what happens when their exceptionless law hits reality and breaks? Well, you create a safety net. The Cambridge History of Linguistics explicitly confirms that Osthoff and Brugmann didn't just publish their law. They simultaneously packaged it with two escape categories from day one: analogy and borrowing. It's basically the scientific equivalent of a get-out-of-jail-free card in Monopoly. The rule is absolute, unless a word breaks it, in which case we just safely explained it away by saying, oh, it was borrowed from another dialect, or it changed by analogy. And this leads us perfectly into Section 3, a perfectly unfalsifiable loop, the circular logic. Let's walk through this logical loophole like we're detective uncovering a trap. Step 1, you declare to the scientific community that your sound laws have 0 exceptions. Step 2, you go out into the field and sure enough, you find a word that clearly breaks your law. Step 3, instead of admitting the law is broken, you just label the word a borrowing or an analogy. And finally, Step 4, you go back to the public and claim your law is still exceptionless. Do you see it? Any falsifying data is simply reclassified to protect the theory. The whole framework prevents any objective testing of its own core principles. It's a closed loop.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that it isn't just some random observation from the outside looking in. Modern, peer-reviewed literature openly admits this massive structural flaw. There's a 2014 paper in the Language and Linguistics Compass that states point-blank that the Neogrammarian belief in exceptionless sound change is not a falsifiable hypothesis, because every single apparent exception is just explained away by those escape clauses. Literally no data can ever falsify the original claim. That takes us to Section 4, the critics' pushback, the whistleblowers of linguistics.
It's absolutely vital to remember that not all scientists blindly accepted this unprovable loop. Let's contrast the viewpoints here. On one side, we have the rigid Neogrammarian doctrine, this idea that sound changes happen blindly and uniformly across all words simultaneously. But contrast that with actual sociolinguistic research from experts like Hugo Schuchardt back in the day, and much later, modern research into lexical diffusion by William Labov. Their findings show a way messier reality. Words actually change at completely different rates based on how frequently they're used.
Let's actually zoom in on Hugo Schuchardt for a second. His 1885 critique was absolutely devastating to the Neogrammarian framework. Schuchardt was a leading dialectologist of his era, and he proved that rarely used words and frequently used words change entirely differently. This frequency effect produces systematic, irregular patterns in language that simply cannot be conveniently swept under the rug as borrowings. And honestly, the most incredible part, his formal critique has never actually been formally refuted within the field. No way. They just kind of moved on.
Which brings us to our final section, hypothesis versus rigid doctrine, and why it matters for science.
So, the crucial point here is that even internal historical analyses from within the discipline acknowledge this reality.
A Rice University analysis of Osthoff and Brugmann's foundational work straight up states that exceptionless-ness functioned as a doctrine rather than hypothesis. Those are their words, not ours. The field itself admits that the absolute bedrock of historical language reconstruction is a definitional commitment, a rigid belief system, and not an actually demonstrated, tested scientific hypothesis.
And this is exactly why this matters for science. When a scientific field encounters conflicting evidence, it is supposed to adapt or completely discard its hypothesis. Let's clearly define the difference here. A standard scientific hypothesis is vulnerable. It's designed to be broken and disproven by new, conflicting data. That vulnerability is actually its superpower. A rigid doctrine, on the other hand, is designed to be invincible. It just endlessly expands its own exception categories, like constantly redefining what counts as an analogy or a borrowing, just to absorb conflicting data without ever admitting fault. The current framework of exceptionless sound laws completely fails modern scientific falsification standards precisely because it behaves like a rigid doctrine.
So, what does this all mean? Well, it leaves us with a pretty massive, fascinating question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. If the very foundational rules of historical linguistics, rules accepted as gospel for over a century, operate as an unprovable, self-sealing loop, what other unquestioned academic axioms out there might just be rigged games?
Now, for decades, a very specific consensus has dominated the history books, claiming we know exactly when and where this language was spoken based on reconstructed vocabulary. But as we're going to see today, when we actually put this evidence under the microscope, the story changes dramatically. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll cover the wheel vocabulary argument, the circular logic trap, the Anatolian contradiction, the ancient DNA verdict, and finally, consensus versus reality. Let's get into it. We really have to start with the ultimate historical mystery here. Think about it. How exactly do experts attempt to trace and date an ancestral language thousands of years before the very first written records even existed? We're talking about an era long, long before clay tablets or papyrus. It requires intense linguistic detective work, but as we're about to learn, that kind of detective work is highly vulnerable to human bias.
Just to ensure we're all on exactly the same page, here is what we mean when we talk about Proto-Indo-European, or PIE for short. It's an unwritten, entirely reconstructed ancestral language. Linguists basically work backward from modern languages like English, Spanish, Hindi, and Russian to reverse engineer this hypothetical mother tongue that they all supposedly sprang from.
Section 1. The Wheel Vocabulary Argument and David Anthony's Steppe Hypothesis.
The prevailing historical model relies heavily on the work of scholar David Anthony. Back in 2007, he famously argued that linguists had successfully reconstructed PIE words for wheel, axle, yoke, and domesticated horse. And the logic here makes intuitive sense, right? A language can only contain vocabulary for a specific technology if that technology was actually known to its speakers. Therefore, Anthony reasoned the language must have existed exactly when those wheeled technologies were invented. This anchored Proto-Indo-European firmly to the Eurasian steppe right around 3500 to 3300 BCE. But take a really close look at the timeline here. Archaeologists had already established that 3500 BCE date from physical wheel remains, actual excavations at sites like Santashta long before the linguistic argument was ever applied to it. The linguistic reconstruction didn't miraculously produce the date. The date was already there, and the linguistics were just later shown to be consistent with it. Yet by 2015, Anthony and his colleague Don Ring were claiming this vocabulary as independent confirmation of the timeline.
Section 2. The Circular Logic Trap, or as it's better understood, the self-fulfilling prophecy.
If you want a simple briefing on why this methodology is so problematic, it basically functions like a giant self-fulfilling prophecy. Step 1. You start with a theoretical framework assuming the speakers lived on the steppe. Step 2. That assumed steppe placement shapes which word reconstructions you consider plausible, which effectively molds your linguistic data to fit the framework the archaeologist had already established. And then, Step 3, you turn around and claim those reconstructed words independently prove the steppe origin. It is, by definition, circular logic.
And, we aren't the only ones noticing this trap. Even prominent, highly respected scholars in the field, like J.P. Mallory, have explicitly acknowledged the limitations of this approach. Mallory profoundly noted that, despite all the vocabulary evidence, the homeland problem remains unsolved. Think about that for a second. That statement simply wouldn't be true if this vocabulary evidence was the ironclad, independent confirmation it's so often presented as.
Section 3. The Anatolian Contradiction. Let's look at what happens when one data set yields two totally different timelines.
This brilliantly illustrates the core problem with linguistic dating. On one hand, we have David Anthony's steppe hypothesis, pinning the language to 3500 BCE. But on the other hand, we have scholar Colin Renfrew who proposed a completely different location, Anatolia, and a date between 7000 and 6000 BCE. We are talking about an incredible 3,700-year difference here.
And here is the absolute kicker. To build his Anatolian hypothesis, Colin Renfrew used the exact same comparative linguistic root data, but because he applied a competing methodology for matching that data to archaeology, tying the language's spread to the spread of farming instead of the invention of the wheel, he reached a completely opposite date and place. This perfectly proves the inherent ambiguity of linguistic data. It simply cannot independently verify dates or locations when the exact same roots can be mapped to totally different archaeological events.
Section 4. The Ancient DNA Verdict. This is where hard science steps in. In 2022, a genuinely groundbreaking ancient DNA study led by Lazaridis was published. Instead of relying on reconstructed, invisible vocabulary, this team went ahead and tested the actual, physical genetic origins of the ancient people theorized in these linguistic models. They looked specifically at the Anatolian branch of the Indo-European family tree, which is an ancient language offshoot located in modern-day Turkey.
So the crucial point we need to highlight here is this. The hard genetic data from Lazaridis definitively showed that the Anatolian branch did not emerge from the steppe. This directly contradicts the core predictions of the Anthony and Ringe model, which specifically claimed Anatolian absolutely came from that steppe origin. The vocabulary dating argument essentially collapsed the moment it came into contact with actual genetic evidence applied to its own predicted branches.
Section 5. Consensus versus reality, and why independent evidence absolutely matters. The big takeaway you should remember from this explainer is the stark difference between what gets repeated as consensus and what actually holds up as reality. Academic consensus has long treated vocabulary reconstructions as if they confirm archaeological dates. But the evidence-based reality shows us that for linguistic dating to be scientifically valid at all, it must remain strictly independent of pre-existing archaeological estimates. You cannot use an archaeological date to build a linguistic model and then turn around and use that same model to prove the date. In fact, as we've seen, independent archaeological and genetic data often conflicts entirely with these forced linguistic timelines.
I really want to leave you with this provocative thought to consider the next time you hear a definitive claim about ancient, unwritten human history. If the linguistic timelines we have trusted for decades don't even match up with the hard DNA evidence, we have to ask ourselves, how much of our accepted ancient history is just an academic, self-fulfilling prophecy?
We're going to look strictly at the data, treat this as a straightforward briefing, and see if the foundation actually holds up to modern scrutiny.
Here is our audit itinerary for today. We'll be covering 1. The family tree theory, 2. Zero material evidence, 3. The method's time limits, 4. Compounding inferential errors, and finally 5. A speculative working model. So, Section 1. The family tree theory.
Where did Sanskrit come from is the central mystery we're investigating today, right? And it's a question most people, honestly, even seasoned academics, assume has been completely settled by verified historical science. We're taught that Sanskrit is just one branch on this very well-mapped ancient tree. But since we're auditing this claim today, we have to ask, how exactly was that tree mapped out in the first place?
The mainstream model presents this remarkably clean lineage. It steps down from a proposed ancient root language known as Proto-Indo-European, or PIE. From there, it branches into an intermediate node called Proto-Indo-Iranian. And then finally, from that intermediate node, it arrives at the attested language of Old Sanskrit. Now, on paper, this three-step sequence looks incredibly solid and logical. But things get really interesting when we try to find the physical proof for those first two steps.
Which brings us to Section 2, Zero material evidence.
There's a really stark contrast between how verified historical science usually operates and the complete lack of physical historical records anchoring this specific linguistic tree. Normally, historical science demands actual stuff, texts, artifacts, physical evidence. But the proposed family tree for Sanskrit relies on purely reconstructed models. There are absolutely zero inscriptions and zero manuscript fragments for its ancestral roots.
According to comprehensive technical references from the field, like Michael Meier-Brügger's work on Indo-European linguistics and Benjamin Fortson's texts, these critical ancestral notes possess absolutely zero attested records. Proto-Indo-European, no tablets, no transcribed oral traditions. Proto-Indo-Iranian, exact same story. There is no material evidence of any kind for these languages. They exist entirely as reconstructions. So the crucial takeaway here is that every single word, sound, and grammatical feature attributed to these ancestral languages is simply an inferred projection. We're trying to explain the origins of an incredibly well-documented language, Sanskrit, using a root that is completely unobservable. It's a theoretical model. It's not an attested historical object.
All right, moving on to Section 3, the method's time limits. This entire family tree relies heavily on what's called the comparative method. Simply put, linguists look at known, attested daughter languages, like Sanskrit or Avestan, and they work backward, reverse engineering what the parent language must have sounded like. It's a really clever technique, for sure. But it requires projecting backward through thousands of years of completely undocumented, unrecorded linguistic change.
And this brilliantly illustrates the time problem. The proposed origin of Proto-Indo-European sits roughly between 3300 and 4500 BCE. That means PI reconstruction requires reaching back to a staggering depth of 5500 to 6500 years from the earliest historically attested daughter languages. We're talking about a massive chasm of time with literally zero physical documentation.
So why does that massive time gap actually matter? Well, let's look at the limits of the tool itself. As Johanna Nichols, an award-winning linguist from the Linguistics Society of America, establishes, the comparative method is strictly restricted to shallow time depths. At massive time depths, the method completely loses its resolution and reliability. Nichols notes that at these ranges, it becomes essentially impossible to distinguish whether reconstructed resemblances apply to 12,000 years ago or 40,000 years ago. The required time depth for PIE sits right at or completely beyond this reliable limit. Which leads right into Section 4. Compounding inferential errors.
Remember our 3 steps from earlier? Well, here is where those methodological limits become a massive issue. Step 1 requires reconstructing PIE from attested languages. Step 2 uses that purely hypothetical PIE reconstruction combined with others to reconstruct Proto-Indo-Iranian. And finally, Step 3 uses that reconstructed Proto-Indo-Iranian to explain the origins of Sanskrit. When you use one completely unattested model to build a second completely unattested model, you're effectively trying to build a bridge out of invisible, unverified materials.
Let's break down why this is so problematic from an investigative standpoint. Reconstructing just one unattested language already carries a heavy layer of inferential uncertainty. But when you use that first reconstruction to build another, you aren't just adding error, you are multiplying it. The Sanskrit lineage is forced to pass through 2 consecutive inferential steps without a single external check. Because there's no independent physical evidence at either node, the total margin of error compounds immensely. As Nichols confirmed, the method's resolution fails precisely in these situations where independent evidence is entirely absent.
This brings us to our final section, Section 5, a speculative working model. Over 200 years of intense scholarship, highly sophisticated ancient DNA studies, and phylogenetic computational analyses have been poured into proving this exact family tree. Generations of academics have tried to lock this down as settled historical fact. And yet, what is the current scholarly view? J.P. Mallory, who is widely recognized as one of the field's top experts, offered a very telling admission in his 2025 assessment. He stated plainly, "There is still no totally convincing solution to the homeland question." Just think about that for a second. If this family tree were an established, verified historical fact, 2 centuries of the world's best research would have yielded a convincing solution by now, but it just hasn't.
Therefore, as skeptical historians, we really have to call it what it is. A genealogical tree whose root and primary branches are totally unattested, which relies on a methodology pushed way past its reliable time limits and which compounds errors through consecutive checklist steps. Well, it cannot be called verified history. It must be correctly classified as a speculative working model. It's a hypothesis, the field's current best guess, sure, but it remains entirely unverified by material historical standards.
So given that the foundation of this ancient language tree lacks any physical proof and operates on heavily compounded inferential models, I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought. Is it time we update our textbooks to reflect the actual historical evidence, rather than presenting a 200-year-old hypothesis as settled fact?
If a linguistic family tree lacks any attested physical roots, relies on circular dating,
actively contradicts modern genetic DNA evidence and fundamentally fails its own mathematical timelines? Is it rigorous history, or is it just a theoretical model? I encourage you to keep evaluating these established paradigms with a critical, data-driven eye. Thank you so much for joining me today, and keep asking those tough questions.